by embracing hard money and utilizing energy to mine Bitcoin. So the whole formula for money has changed. Money is now energy and information because Bitcoin is energy information.
Hey everyone, my name is Aaron Stanley, and today I'm here with Samson Mow, who many of you may know as Excellion on Twitter. Samson is a longtime member of the Bitcoin community, and he's currently playing a really important role in promoting Bitcoin adoption in Latin America and other emerging markets. And we're going to be diving into all of that today. So Samson, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Aaron. Great to be on.
So you've been in the Bitcoin community for a long time and have played a number of different roles. Could you give us a quick introduction, maybe for our audience who may not be familiar?
Sure. So I'm Samson. I'm the CEO of Jan3. I also have a game development company called Pixelmatic. But yeah, I started out in the Bitcoin space working at a crypto exchange, Bitcoin exchange called BTC China. And it was one of the biggest exchanges in mining pools. And after I left that, I joined Blockstream, which is a Bitcoin infrastructure company. And I worked with Adam Back to deploy Layer 2 scaling tech like Lightning and Liquid and building a lot of cool stuff.
Tell us more about your new project, Jan3, and what's the project, what's the motivation behind it, and what's the significance of the name?
Yeah, so Jan3 obviously is the date at which the Genesis block was launched in 2009. And Jan3 is a Bitcoin tech company. We build the Aqua wallet, which is a Bitcoin and Layer 2 wallet. And we also work on advising nation states to implement Bitcoin strategies. So we've helped El Salvador pass with their Bitcoin law, digital securities laws, and helping them structure the Bitcoin bond or volcano bond. And since we've had a lot more interest in Bitcoin adoption around the world, so we've met with the government of Colombia, Suriname, Montenegro, and a number of others. And it seems to be that in recent months, there's even more interest. So we've been flying around even more lately.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dive into that and learn a bit more about these conversations and what the dynamics are. Before we dive into that, maybe talk about why do you believe Bitcoin is uniquely suited to solve financial challenges in like underdeveloped countries, especially when you're comparing that to other cryptocurrencies that also sort of claim to be trying to do the same thing.
Well, I think it's important to first distinguish that there is Bitcoin and then there's everything else. Bitcoin is a unique asset class, and it cannot be compared to crypto projects. Like I've seen some altcoin, I forgot which one, but the founder is this guy that said, all governments are going to be using my project in 10, 20 years. But, these are centralized blockchains or distributed ledger technologies, and they can be easily replicated. But Bitcoin is digital scarcity, and that cannot be reproduced. And with digital scarcity comes value because it cannot be modified or influenced or changed. So it's sort of like digital gold, and it's the same reason why countries hold gold. They should also want Bitcoin. They want something that's valuable, either as a reserve asset or a part of their treasury, or just something that they want to augment their currency with.
So as you've been traveling around the world, talking to various governments, officials, talking about Bitcoin with these folks, what are the objectives here? What are you trying to convince them of? What are you trying to educate them of? And what are the next steps that you're trying to induce them to take?
So there's a number of ways that a country can adopt Bitcoin. It could be issuing a law like the Bitcoin law in El Salvador, making Bitcoin legal tender, or it could be allowing Bitcoin to be used for payment. So in some places, say like Indonesia, they've banned Bitcoin as a form of payment. So that would need to be removed. Right now, I'm in Switzerland. Switzerland, there's no capital gains tax, so you could technically use Bitcoin to pay for things. But for example, here we would seek to have some sort of acknowledgement of Bitcoin that it can be used for payments and is recommended to be used for payments. But even without that, like the city of Lugano, they're already using Bitcoin, right? You can pay your taxes in Bitcoin. But that's one dimension of it. The other one is mining Bitcoin, either setting up mining operations to take advantage of excess energy or to issue a Bitcoin financial instrument like a Bitcoin bond that will use that capital raise to mine Bitcoin. And I guess the third one is just adding Bitcoin to your balance sheet or treasury to hold Bitcoin. So there's three main categories of things that countries can do. So for Jan 3, our interest is to see which path makes the most sense for them, what they're interested in, and which of these align with their goals.
And then how are these conversations being received by the folks you're meeting with? Are these points, I would assume it's probably a lot easier now to have these conversations than maybe it was 5 years ago, just given some of the legitimacy that Bitcoin has achieved in that period. But, just give us some feedback on like how are these conversations progressing? Like what's the level of interest that you're seeing?
We see a lot of interest. I think part of the challenge is that most governments are slow moving. So, for example, in Colombia, the president there was very receptive to it, and he wanted to, get the news out there that he's looking at Bitcoin. But it's slow moving, so we have to just be persistent. But as you're saying, like recent months, it seems to be heating up more so than before, possibly because of Bitcoin kind of stabilizing, if you will, or just increased institutional acceptance of Bitcoin. So we see the ETFs gobbling up more Bitcoin. So these seem to be indicating that Bitcoin is here to stay. And more countries are looking at it. So we've had outreach where people have come to us and have arranged meetings with the government. So it seems to be warming up for sure.
So which arguments or like which talking points or which kind of like what themes are resonating most with these folks? Like what are they kind of latching onto when you're kind of giving your kind of your spiel about like why Bitcoin is important, why they should be considering it? Like what are the angles that they're like oh wow, we didn't realize this, but we need to be paying attention to it?
It differs from different countries and their, I guess, economic standing. So more developed countries are interested in maintaining their advantage and not falling behind or losing out to innovation that Bitcoin can bring. More developing countries are interested in getting ahead or getting out of debt, say with the IMF or World Bank. So they're looking at Bitcoin as a tool to escape that impoverishment that's being forced upon them. So it varies, but generally there's a lot of interest in Bitcoin, especially these days.
What's the significance of having several U.S. presidential candidates talking about Bitcoin, showing up at Bitcoin conferences, taking pro-Bitcoin positions? How does this help in your conversations that you're having?
It definitely helps a lot. And the interesting thing is a lot of countries or politicians, they look towards the US for guidance. And we saw this with the ETF. So Hong Kong and Australia, they wanted to wait until the US approved the ETFs and then they approved theirs. But I think it's going to be the same situation in terms of larger scale Bitcoin adoption at the nation state level. They're going to wait and see what Trump does. And it is very meaningful to have multiple candidates in the race that have talked about Bitcoin and have talked about setting up that strategic Bitcoin reserve. It's somewhere in the order of probably 1 million to 4 million coins. And that's very ambitious. And I think if Trump wins, he'll likely move ahead and implement that because Trump likes to do to fulfill his campaign promises. It may not be to the full scope, but he likes to have said, I did that thing that I promised. So if he creates a strategic Bitcoin reserve of even 250,000, that's a big step. And all those other countries that are watching the US will definitely take that as a signal that they should go ahead and move on their Bitcoin strategy. But there's a danger there too, because the first mover always has the biggest advantage. So if you look at the ETFs again as an example, the US has almost 1 million Bitcoin in their ETFs. And then Hong Kong, which launched second, has 10,000 some odd Bitcoin, and Australia has 100 something. So you can see, like, if you wait for the US to make the first move in terms of setting up a Bitcoin strategic reserve, you may not have a lot of Bitcoin down the road. And we do see that competition heating up between all these different countries and entities accumulating. So you have, in addition to the ETFs in the US, you have companies like MicroStrategy, Tether, which are accumulating massive amounts of Bitcoin, and other countries mining Bitcoin like Bhutan. So there's not a lot of Bitcoin left. And I think perhaps most governments don't fully understand that it's a limited supply, because in the fiat world, it's all unlimited. You can print as much as you want. But with Bitcoin, there's definitely a point at which you cannot compete it and get a lot of Bitcoin. Like, how hard is it going to be to get 250,000 Bitcoin for the next MicroStrategy? Almost impossible because,
Yeah, what's the thing? It's like MicroStrategy, Tether, like the ETFs in the US. These guys are not going to stop buying Bitcoin, right? It doesn't seem like Michael Saylor is going to stop anytime soon. And then now you have, if the US goes first and if Trump is able to buy 1 million Bitcoins for this reserve, which seems far fetched, but like, hey, if it happens, like there's not much Bitcoin left. Like how much, I mean, it's over what, like 95% of the Bitcoins that will ever be mined have been mined already. Right. So there's not that much left. And, yeah, it's easy to see how like an arms race could happen here, for just trying to accumulate this stuff as fast as possible. If Trump does, like, say if he does win and he's like, this is the first thing we're doing when I enter office is buying Bitcoin, which is obviously probably not going to happen. But if he does like signal that this is a priority, that could trigger, potentially an arms race of people trying to maybe front run the US in some way, or like, yeah, I mean, once Bitcoin hits 1 million, it's going to be a lot tougher to to like get in on that game, right? So so that is something, but that is something that, like, I mean, I'll confess, I'd never even heard the idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve floated until like this past summer when Trump and I think like Cynthia Lummis was talking about it. But I was like, wow, that's actually a really good idea. And I mean, is that something that has been resonating with other countries? Like once that idea started being circulated, are people like, hey, maybe we should consider doing this too? Is that something they're taking seriously?
Well, this is what we are working on at Jan 3 to meet and tell them, hey, this is happening in the US. Do you have a plan? Do you want a plan? But, people are easily distracted by their own problems. Every country has their own social, economic things to deal with. But it's kind of our mission to tell them, hey, these are the different things happening around the world, and it's time to get prepared. And the question is, which place in line do you want to be? Do you want to be first, second, or 20th? So it's bringing these topics up and presenting them and really getting their eyes open to the state of the world that is important, I think. And we'll see which ones go first. But there's definitely a first mover advantage. And it could be that second and third place never catch up to number one.
That's interesting. That's kind of been my thesis around El Salvador. Why I find El Salvador so fascinating is that, like, like directionally, I feel like they're directionally correct. Where like at some point, it's inevitable they're going to end up being like the richest country in the world, if they keep doing what they're doing, right? I mean, or maybe not, like, but you know what I mean? Like they're going to end up, like, there's no way this is not going to be successful if everything kind of goes according to how we're envisioning things progressing here in the future. And having that first mover advantage for such a small country seems like, like in 100 years time, people could be looking back on this like, wow, that was like the best decision anyone could have possibly made. And I want to just kind of like touch on the El Salvador story quickly, because I know you're pretty heavily involved in that, and want to just get some like reflections on like how do you think this is going so far, and like how do they kind of move the ball forward, like 3 years into this experiment.
Well, I think it's gone quite well for them. It's definitely a massive rebrand where people consider it as Bitcoin country and they want to go there with their families. It's boosted GDP, it's boosted tourism, it's had many positive effects on the country. And the challenge I see is moving forward, what happens in 4 or 5 years? What happens at the end of Bukele's term? And this is why also we are doing what we're doing at Jan 3, because we want more Bitcoin countries, and we have to take advantage of this time that we've been given where we have this anchor point, which is a country that has made Bitcoin a core part of their strategy and has made it legal tender. So if we do nothing and we just wait, then maybe this will all fizzle out in a few years' time. But this is an opportunity, I think, where we can take this and run with it and get more countries on board. And it's better this way, too, that there are more countries holding Bitcoin than just, a handful of countries, and predominantly Western countries like the US and the UK and big countries like China. You want more countries holding Bitcoin like Argentina, Ecuador, Peru, and, distribution of wealth around the world. Well, it's a tale as old as time, right? The loan sharks don't like it when you make their business redundant, and that's really what Bitcoin does. Like these groups can only lend out money that can be printed easily, right? Creating the SDR like does not exist, and unfortunately, it still kind of can be used as a bargaining chip by giving cheap money to these countries. But Bitcoin makes it so that you don't need that anymore. You can actually take a slow, steady, sustainable path to growth by embracing hard money and utilizing energy to mine Bitcoin. So the whole formula for money has changed. Money is now energy and information because Bitcoin is energy information. So you can mine Bitcoin using geothermal or hydro or whatever you have that previously you could not utilize, right? With oil, it's easy. You put it into a bucket or a barrel and you ship it. But with geothermal, what's the incentive? Unless you want to create some energy intensive industry that uses it on site, there's not much you can do. But Bitcoin changes that. And I think it is going to have a massive effect as countries discover this, that, hey, we're actually a rich country, right? And a lot of the countries that have massive geothermal energy reserves are quite poor relatively. So this whole equation is changing the world, and we'll see that playing out to further make these things, these organizations like the IMF and the World Bank redundant.
So do you think that the El Salvador case study or the experiment has helped it to like reduce dependency on the IMF or these types of groups so far, or is that kind of like a 5, 10 year, 20-year play in the future as this all matures?
It's hard to say. I think El Salvador is still engaging with the IMF because possibly they want funding from the IMF, but it's definitely put them on a good trajectory, not just Bitcoin itself, but good management, and that they're not fiscally irresponsible. So, their traditional bonds are trading at the highest amount that they have been in decades. But we just see like Bitcoin, countries that embrace Bitcoin or are open to Bitcoin seem to be far more fiscally responsible. And that definitely has an impact on just general well-being of these economies.
So we've, over the last couple of years since El Salvador made their big announcements and their big moves, we've seen a number of other countries kind of flirting with this idea of adopting Bitcoin or legalizing Bitcoin or making it legal tender. Places like Panama, I think like Central African Republic was up on there too. And, and these things, they had some momentum, then they kind of fizzled out, or they didn't make it across the finish line for whatever reason. But like, why haven't we seen other nation states really replicate what El Salvador has done as of yet? I mean, I think there's a number of factors. Maybe like you have a very sort of charismatic, motivated politician, head of state in El Salvador that is obviously sort of pushing this and kind of staking his own reputation on this, which that's a pretty unique thing. But generally, like what's maybe taking longer than maybe some people would have thought for this kind of hyper Bitcoinization to occur on a nation state level?
Interesting question. I would say we just need more time. But Central African Republic was more trying to use it as a marketing stunt. I don't think they really understood Bitcoin, or they were just kind of trying to ride the coattails of El Salvador. But you could say Argentina's opened up to Bitcoin, right? They still have dealings with the IMF, so they can't arbitrarily do something as bold as El Salvador. But Milei has deregulated money, and he's said kind of between the lines, you can use Bitcoin, or his government has said you can use Bitcoin to settle trade. So there's kind of an implicit understanding that you can use Bitcoin in Argentina because he wants competition between currencies. So it's another path to Bitcoin adoption. But I think the important thing to understand is, like, if you've read Confessions of an Economic Hitman, you know that there are forces out there that don't want Bitcoin to be adopted. And these probably are running interference with people that do want Bitcoin to be adopted. But ultimately, Bitcoin is on the verge of failure. So it's just a matter of time, really. And hopefully we at Jan3 can help. Is inevitable. Everyone will need Bitcoin because all of the fiat currencies are on the push this process along and make it a bit faster.
No, it's interesting that you mentioned Confessions of an Economic Hitman, because that's kind of it was one of those books that's helped form my worldview back when I was younger, and it was really one of these. It helps you just kind of understand the world better for like how it actually operates, right? And like how these international financial systems, how they're all kind of masked in like flowery, like rhetoric, like, oh, we're here to like do good for the world or whatever. But a lot of this stuff is like pretty predatory, right? And for me, like that was one of the first things that resonated with me about Bitcoin as well. Was like, wow, like this could actually be. This is something that exists outside of that framework that countries, people can latch onto and leverage outside of this kind of predatory scheme that's been kind of running our world financial system for the longest time.
Yeah, well, money is a very potent form of control. So he who controls the money controls the people. You can incentivize people to do things like build roads. Like if you can print money, you can make them build roads or go fight in wars or do a number of things. And it's also a way to control other countries too. So if they're dependent on your money, not just in Latin America, but in Africa with the CFA franc, you can extract resources. You can extract human resources or physical resources or whatever you want, as long as you control the money. So this is why Bitcoin is so disruptive and so powerful, because it breaks that ability for people to control others. Well, so long as you're holding Bitcoin in your own self-custody and you have your own keys. But you get the idea. It really transforms the entire landscape of the world. And the best part is that it is inevitable. So even if we didn't do anything, this will come to pass. A Bitcoin standard will come to pass because there is no alternative. There's no way a government can save the fiat currency. It means that you'd have to have massive amounts of restraint and discipline to not print, and we know that's not possible.
Yeah, I mean we've seen the discipline just go out the window over the last few years, right? It's just a question of people in Latin America will pile into stable coins, right, as a way of hedging against their own currency. But it's like, well, the US dollar is also depreciating in the same way as it's just maybe not as fast as some of the other currencies, but it's still depreciating, right? It's still all headed in the same direction at the end of the day, right? So when we talk about Bitcoin adoption at a national scale, and you gave a few different definitions of what we mean by Bitcoin adoption. There's a variety of different things that could mean. Like how viable is this over the next like 5-10 years? Really from kind of a mass adoption standpoint, I guess we'll call it. And I mean, I guess there's probably some Bitcoiners out there who might push back on this idea that we need to be promoting this in like a top-down fashion, and that Bitcoin needs to be kind of this organic, sort of bottom-up, more of an organic thing, I guess. So just love your kind of thoughts on like you're saying it's inevitable. Like how does it actually get to the point where it's inevitable like this?
Well, it has to do with Bitcoin increasing in value, right? So as Bitcoin number goes up, then it gets harder and harder to have people accept the fiat, because it's more apparent that when Bitcoin is at 1 million or $5 million a coin, do people still want to get paid in pesos or Canadian dollars or yen? I don't think so, right? Like it's difficult to see it now, although as Bitcoiners we see it, going from 0 to 66K or 67, whatever we're at now, it kind of shows you like this thing is rapidly increasing and there's no stopping it. And for other people, I think you have to see it. They'll probably need to see it at 250,000 and higher before that realization dawns on them, because you cannot look at this asset class that has gone from 0 to 250,000 in 20 years and still say, well, it's just a fad, and the fiat currency that's dropped another 100% in value and purchasing power is going to somehow come back, right? There's a point of no coming back. And I think this is a problem that most of the models for Bitcoin price appreciation miss out on, which is they're projecting for decades. I think it's more like 5 to 10 years, if that. And at some point you just stop accepting fiat, because why would you? Like, when do you stop accepting the German Papier mark, right? You stop at some point. Either you have to reset or you use something else, but there is a termination point for fiat currencies. So that is where that goes. But to your other question is, why should we educate governments and politicians on Bitcoin? I think it has to do that we can have better policy come out here to enshrine the rights of Bitcoiners and private property, ownership of property, as we move through this Bitcoin adoption cycle. Because one thing we've learned in past years is that the laws and your rights don't really matter anymore, right? If you take Canada as an example, just a protest induced the government to implement emergency measures, the Emergency Act, which is martial law, right? And well, what rights do you have under martial law? Not many. So anything can be used to attack the population, and the property rights seem to be just an afterthought at that point. But maybe as we work with countries to implement these Bitcoin strategies, we can augment the laws that protect people and protect your Bitcoin. Because there's one thing that's interesting right now, which is, a government can say you have Bitcoin. Maybe they think you did. Maybe you lost it, right? There's the boating accident joke, but what if you really did lose it or was stolen from you, but the government still says you have it and they lock you in a jail or throw you in the gulag? What recourse do you have? Because it's difficult to prove you don't have something. So there's a lot of work that has to be done to better protect Bitcoiners and people in general, because the current laws are not going to cut it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I haven't actually thought about that, where it's how do you prove that you don't own something, right? It's like, okay, I bought this Bitcoin on an exchange, once, and it was in a wallet of mine once, but then like I've lost the seed phrase, like it fell in the lake, whatever, and like I don't have access to this Bitcoin anymore. Are you going to throw me in the gulag? Or are you going to come and like, it's like an unrealized capital gains tax of some sort, right?
Exactly. All of these rules and regulations and laws are designed for a system that is self-contained, right? It's designed for equities. Do you have, I don't know, pick a stock, Microsoft stock? Yeah, you do, because the brokerage says you have it. You obviously have it. You can't lose Microsoft stock, right? But with bearer assets coming back, and I think that's another battle we'll be fighting, but bearer assets means you can lose something, right? If you have bearer certificates, you can lose a bearer certificate, right? You can lose Bitcoin, and there's no protection to prevent the state from coming after you saying, hey, you owe me money because you have or had this thing. So there's a lot of things that we have to improve on and to work to optimizing for a world that's living on a Bitcoin standard. And it's largely to empower the individual and make sure that, your rights as a sovereign individual are respected and enshrined.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Policies that are that are in the interest of like Bitcoin holders, right? Securing the rights of Bitcoin holders. Because Bitcoin may be inevitable, but like it may be the type of thing where, if it's illegal to touch it, it's illegal to use it. Like you may have to like risk your life to use it or send it or something. Like there could be all sorts of policies put in place that constrain the rights of being a Bitcoin holder so much to the point where it loses all of its utility, right? They can't just make the asset disappear, but they could make it so cumbersome and difficult to use it that it kind of there's no real reason to hold it anymore, right? Or it's too dangerous or whatever.
There's no threat to Bitcoin itself, but there is a threat to Bitcoiners and people that have Bitcoin. So that is what I think we need to work towards improving the rights of individuals.
And if there's anything that's been consistently proven true over time, it's that I think like governments and folks in authority will academics or whoever will always find some new line of attack against Bitcoin, right? Whether it's like, oh, it's money laundering, it's used for gambling, it's used for terrorist financing, it's used for it's ESG problems, it's not green enough. I mean, that one's kind of died off pretty significantly now that like BlackRock is offering this product, but haven't heard a whole lot of ESG FUD lately. But
the interesting thing is all of laws and all these things can be changed based on your interpretation of it, right? Like recently I'm seeing, I think Elon Musk posted something like, it's some newspaper that says the free speech is dangerous, right? So even though it's protected in the First Amendment, will it continue to be protected if enough people in control deem it to be a danger to society? Who knows? But you can definitely see everything's open to interpretation. Like just in Canada, who's the terrorist? The protesters are terrorists, right? So what we want is Bitcoiners in the government. So you have to start from somewhere. Either a Bitcoiner's got to go run for office, or you meet the people in charge right now and you teach them about Bitcoin. Because the only protection against this dystopian world is that everyone becomes a Bitcoiner.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's the only way to prevent against that, right? And and I think your earlier point about how we're going to reach the point once Bitcoin hits a certain price where people finally do realize that it's inevitable, right? And like you stop fielding these annoying questions from a guy at the bar who's like, "Well, how can Bitcoin have value if it's not backed by anything?" Right? Once we get to that point, then it's like, okay, now we finally made it, right? So like you've been arguing recently that you think Bitcoin is very undervalued in terms of its price, and you're arguing that the market is not effectively pricing in the true value for a variety of reasons. And you even kind of drawn some sort of big short analogies, basically, to the subprime housing market era in the U.S. And wondering if you could just touch on really quickly, like, why do you think Bitcoin is so undervalued? Like, today at the current price is like 66,000 or something. But why do you think this is not reflective of its true value right now?
Well, it doesn't seem right that we've been in consolidation for such a long time frame. And if you look at Bitcoin adjusted for inflation, we haven't really had an all-time high, even though we reached 74, right? That's inflation adjusted for inflation. We haven't hit an all-time high yet. But at the same time, you see all the increasing debt in the U.S. Just let's look at the U.S., right? National debt is 35 some odd trillion now. Interest to service the debt is surpassed 1 trillion. So how sustainable is that? There should be a direct correlation between the instability and weakness of fiat and the strength of Bitcoin. And we're not seeing it yet. Gold is rallying. Bitcoin is not rallying. So I tend to believe that there is paper Bitcoin being saturated into the market. And, I think Willy Woo and Adam Back had a discussion about, is it through derivatives or is it through ETFs? And Adam seems to think not. But there's more than one way to saturate the market with paper Bitcoin. You can have a FTX style naked selling, like selling Bitcoin that you don't even have to suppress the price. And while, yes, you have to have enough Bitcoin to facilitate withdrawals, you can also print other things out of thin air if you have a malevolent actor in this space. Like maybe it's altcoins, right? And you print the altcoins to buy Bitcoin, and you kind of are selling Bitcoin that does not exist, but you have enough Bitcoin coming in to meet demands, right? And that would explain kind of why we're stagnant at the 60-ish range, right? Because they're keeping it down, but they can't push it down too much because they still need to buy back to fulfill withdrawals, right? That's my theory. But like, if you ask me, how would I suppress the market? That was how I would do it.
Okay. Not financial advice, but yeah, that does make sense, right? It does make sense as to, and I've had the same sort of, I've been thinking about this too, as well. Like, you just given everything we're seeing in the macro front, it's like, how is this asset not rallying? Like, I understand maybe like altcoins aren't rallying, whatnot, but like, how is it that Bitcoin just hasn't been able to top this, an inflation adjusted all-time high? It just feels off, right?
If you're implementing this, then, you have to sell something, like naked sell something, right? And what would you naked sell? Probably you can do some Bitcoin, but there's a risk there because you have to fulfill withdrawals. But you can naked sell altcoins because no one takes that stuff into self-custody. They're just trading it anyway. So you can flood the market. And I mean, the market is also being flooded by more altcoins too. So maybe that is the way that you sell paper Bitcoin. You dump altcoins that don't exist into the marketplace, and you buy a bit of Bitcoin to meet basic withdrawal requests, and then you can kind of keep the price suppressed.
Yeah, people might be rushing to dump altcoins, but the amount of to sell Bitcoin at this price is probably, there's going to be less demand for withdrawals of Bitcoin at this point than there may have been in the past, right? When people thought it was more of a, from your hodler crowd and whatnot. A couple of last questions here before we wrap up. I wanted to just turn the conversation back to Latin America here, and I know you've been meeting with some folks like Colombia, Suriname, some other places, Argentina. It sounds like you've been following what's going on there, and I just want to get some reflections from you on the state of Bitcoin adoption in Latin America, and like what are the conversations you're having? Like, what are maybe the countries that you're watching with a particular focus, maybe, or have been having fruitful conversations with? I mean, is there anything kind of in the works that we should be paying attention to that like may not be necessarily public yet, but you're kind of clued into?
There are a lot of things in the works, but I don't want to, tip my hand too soon, because it's difficult. Like, we were making a lot of inroads in one country, and the government was ousted. So I don't want to jinx anything that we're working on. But I would say, like, Latin America, I've been saying this for a while. Latin America is ripe for Bitcoin adoption. We just have to keep on pushing it, and when we get closer, you'll know.
Awesome. So, all right. So so keep stay tuned, basically, is the motto of that. So going back to this question of nation states adopting Bitcoin, we do have kind of this peculiar situation where like nation states around the world are among like the largest holders of Bitcoin just due to like criminal seizures. You have like the US and like China and other places. And like, what ultimately happens to this? I know some like the US has auctioned off some of this Bitcoin that they've seized from Silk Road and whatnot, but like, what are the options here? Like, what are nation states ultimately going to do with these Bitcoins that they're sitting on, or what should they be doing, I guess?
Well, if you look at what President Trump said, he said he wanted to convert those into reserve assets in their treasury. So I think it just needs a more formal process to move that somewhere else, so it's not held as proceeds of a seizure or something like that, to give it more clear standing that this is a reserve asset now. But I mean, you're right. A lot of it is just simply seized assets. So they probably need to make some changes or adjustments to reallocate, so to speak, and say these are actually our reserves now, and we're not going to just dump them.
And then I know you're obviously a Bitcoin maximalist, which is why you're doing all this work. But I just wanted to ask if there's any like non-Bitcoin crypto products or use cases that you're particularly excited about or you find might be viable.
Not really.
Okay. All right. Appreciate the honesty. Well, cool. That's well, Samson, really appreciate you coming on the show today. It's been a really good conversation. I've learned a lot from this, and just wanted to throw it back to you for any final thoughts. Maybe things we should be, looking to see in the next 12 months, 6-12 months, just given your work, and anything we should be looking out for. And then how can folks get in touch with you or find you if they want to learn more?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter or X. My handle is Excellion, EXCELLION. Jan3's at Jan3com, and our website's jan3.com. And yeah, I think buy Bitcoin while you still can. Eventually, you can only earn Bitcoin or buy it with your time. And I think we're going to see some impressive moves soon. The spring has been coiled for a very long time.
All right. Well, with that, I would like to wrap this up. Thanks so much, Samson, for your time, for coming on the show. And thanks, everyone, for watching. And we will see you next time.
Thank you.